When a leader speaks, the world listens. But when a nation rises, when a civilization that has seen thousands of years of history, pain, glory, and resilience decides to respond, it does not whisper, it does not stutter, it does not bend. It speaks with a weight so heavy that even the loudest voices of the world fall silent. And that is exactly what happened when India, through the calm yet razor-sharp voice of its foreign minister, delivered a reply to Donald Trump and to the West that sent shockwaves across the globe. It was not just a statement, it was a declaration, it was a revelation, it was a message that the old world order is dying, and the new one has arrived, carried on the shoulders of India's growing strength. And what made it chilling was not the volume, not the aggression, but the certainty in the words, the calm assurance of a nation that no longer fears pressure, that no longer accepts the script written by others, that no longer bows before Western dictates. Let's not kid ourselves. For decades, the West looked at India as a country of potential but never power, a place they could lecture, dictate to, use for cheap labor, and then brush aside when it came to real decisions. They saw India as the eternal follower, a democracy still finding its feet, a nation that should always remain dependent on Western approval. And then Trump, like so many leaders before him, thought he could play the same card, issue threats, make statements about tariffs, about alliances, about consequences, and expect India to bend. But what the West had not realized is that the India of today is not the India of yesterday. This is a nation that has survived colonial looting, that has rebuilt itself from famine to food security, from poverty to technology hubs, from an ignored corner to the world's fifth largest economy. And when Jaishankar spoke, he did not just speak as a minister, he spoke as the voice of 1 billion, plus people who have had enough of being underestimated. Imagine this moment. Cameras flashing, reporters waiting, the Western press already sharpening their pens to spin whatever came out of India as defensive or apologetic. And then Jaishankar, with his calm smile and steady tone, said words that froze the room. He reminded Trump, he reminded the West, that India does not take instructions. India does not operate on threats. India chooses its path based on its own interests, its own people, and its own vision of the future. And the power in those words was not in shouting, not in aggression, but in clarity. Clarity that India knows exactly where it stands. Clarity that India is not looking for validation. Clarity that India will do what is necessary. And if the West does not like it, that's their problem, not India's. Do you understand the psychology here? For decades, the West has thrived on the assumption that other countries crave their approval. They have thrived on this idea that without them, nations cannot rise. They expected India to beg for trade favors, to fear sanctions, to shrink under pressure, but the reply broke that illusion. Jaishankar did not just reply to Trump, he replied to an entire mindset. He replied to centuries of arrogance. He replied to the very foundation of Western dominance, and in that moment the power dynamic shifted. Because when a nation like India, with its sheer size, its booming economy, its military strength, its cultural influence, and its technological innovation, looks the West in the eye and says, "We will decide for ourselves," it is not just a statement. It is a warning, a reminder that the age of Western monopoly is over. Think about the ripple effect. Every nation watching, from Africa to Asia to South America, understood what just happened. They saw that it is possible to resist pressure, to refuse to bend. They saw that if India can stand tall, so can they. The so-called developing world, long chained by Western aid, Western narratives, Western interference, suddenly saw a torchbearer. Because India is not rejecting cooperation, it is rejecting control. And that's a critical difference. India is open to trade, to partnerships, to collaboration. But it will never again accept being treated like a subordinate. And that is exactly what terrifies the West. Not India's size, not just its growth, but its refusal to play the old game. Now, let's talk about Trump himself. A man who thrives on unpredictability, on issuing warnings, on using the weight of the U.S. presidency to intimidate. But when he tried the same with India, the reply was not fear, it was steel. This shook not just Trump, but every Western policymaker who thought they had India mapped out. Because here was proof that India is not just surviving global politics, it is mastering it. And the mastery comes from strategy. Look at how India plays its cards. With Russia, it keeps decades. Old defense ties strong despite Western disapproval. With the U.S., it builds technology and trade bridges, but refuses to be a pawn. With China, it balances competition and caution, making it clear that India is not to be bullied. With Europe, it engages, but on equal terms. And with the global South, it emerges as a leader, a voice of fairness, a partner that treats others with respect. And JAISHANKAR'S statement encapsulated this strategy in one chilling stroke. He basically told the West, "We don't need you to tell us how to act. We already know who we are and what we want." Do you realize how rare that is in global diplomacy? Most nations are careful, always afraid of offending the big powers, always hedging their words. But here, India showed that true confidence comes not from shouting, but from conviction. And that's why the West was shocked. Because they realized they cannot intimidate India anymore. They cannot isolate India. They cannot shame India into compliance. India has become too important, too self-reliant, too globally interconnected to be pushed around. But here's the bigger picture. This reply is not just about Trump. It is about the collapse of an era. The West is used to shaping the world with its narratives. But now narratives are shifting, and who is shaping them? India. Look at technology. Silicon Valley may still be in the U.S., but who runs it? Indians. Look at global CEOs. Google, Microsoft, Adobe, Pepsi. The list goes on. Look at digital payment. India leads the world in transactions. Look at space exploration. India lands on the moon with precision. Look at pharmaceuticals, startups, renewable energy. India is at the forefront. So when India speaks, it speaks not as a follower, but as a pioneer. And when a pioneer speaks with defiance, the world has no choice but to pay attention. And let me tell you why this scares the West more than anything. Because India combines two forces that rarely exist together: economic might and civilizational depth. Most rising economies are young nations still finding their identity, but India carries thousands of years of history, culture, philosophy, resilience. That means when it speaks not just as a country of today, but as a civilization that has outlived empires. This is not just another rising power. This is a nation that has seen Alexander come and go, the Mughals come and go, the British come and go. And every time India survived, every time India rose again. And now, in the 21st century, India is not just surviving, it is leading. That's why JAISHANKAR'S words carried such weight. They were not just policy. They were history speaking. They were civilization speaking. They were the future speaking through the voice of calm diplomacy. And let me remind you, the West is not used to hearing this tone from India. For decades, Indian leaders were polite, cautious, sometimes even apologetic on the global stage. But this generation is different. This leadership does not hesitate to call out hypocrisy. Remember when JAISHANKAR reminded Europe that if they could buy oil from Russia, Why question India for doing the same? That was not just diplomacy, that was exposure of double standards. Remember when he said that Europe must grow out of the mindset that their problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's? That line was not just powerful, it was a mirror showing the West how biased and self-serving their world view has been. These are not the words of a nation seeking approval. These are the words of a nation that knows its worth. And let's talk about the impact on ordinary Indians. Do you know what this reply does to the mindset of the people? For decades, Indians were told to admire the West, to look up to them as the standard. But when they see their minister standing tall, giving a chilling reply to Trump, shocking the West, it changes something deep inside. It ignites pride. It shifts identity from inferiority to confidence. It tells every Indian student, every entrepreneur, every soldier, every citizen, you belong to a nation that no longer takes orders. You belong to a nation that speaks for itself. You belong to a nation that shocks the world not with aggression, but with calm power. That is how civilizations rise, not just through economics and politics, but through confidence, through the belief that we are no less than anyone else. And that belief is spreading like wildfire. Now think of the strategic timing. The world is at a crossroads. America is facing internal division. Europe is struggling with crises. China is aggressive but distrusted. Russia is isolated but resilient. And in this chaos, India stands as the steady hand, growing economically, expanding diplomatically, strengthening militarily, innovating technologically. The reply to Trump is not just about defending India's pride. It is about positioning India as the voice of reason in an unstable world, the voice that is not afraid to challenge power but also not reckless, the voice that speaks with calm but carries strength behind it. That's why this moment matters so much. It is not just a reply, it is a signal that in the multipolar world that is emerging, India will not just be present, it will be central, and the West knows this. They know they cannot stop India's rise. They know that every attempt to pressure India will backfire. They know that sanctions will not work, threats will not work, lectures will not work, because India has alternatives. It has partners across the world. It has a domestic market of over 1 billion people. It has self-reliance projects that reduce dependency. It has technology that rivals the best. And most importantly, it has the will to say no. That willpower is what makes a nation unshakable. And JAISHANKAR'S statement proved to the world that India has that willpower in abundance. So let me be clear. The reply to Trump was not just a moment. It was a milestone. A milestone in India's journey from being seen as a passive nation to being recognized as a decisive power. A milestone in shifting the balance of respect between the West and the rest. A milestone in telling the world that India's voice is not an echo, it is original, it is sharp, it is unignorable. And as the West continues to grapple with this new reality, as they continue to be shocked by India's confidence, the rest of the world will take inspiration. Because when one nation stands tall, others learn to rise. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where India no longer reacts, it leads, a chapter where India does not just participate, it defines. A chapter where the chilling statements of today become the guiding principles of tomorrow. And the world, whether it likes it or not, will have to adjust. Because India has spoken, and when India speaks now, the world listens in shock, in respect, and in acknowledgement of a power that can no longer be denied. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine, backed by innovation. It was not a diplomatic exchange. It was the psychological declaration of India's arrival as an equal power. To understand why this moment carried such an earthquake of significance, you have to recognize the difference between words meant for negotiation and words meant for transformation. Most diplomatic statements are designed to smoothen conflicts, to avoid escalation, to buy time. They are the language of caution, but this one was different. It was not about softening Trump's rhetoric. It was not about bargaining for concessions. It was not about playing a secondary role on the world stage. It was about reshaping how India would be seen forever in the eyes of the West, in the eyes of its rivals, and most importantly in the eyes of its own people. When Jaishankar delivered the reply, the content went far beyond what could be captured in the headlines. On the surface, it was about rejecting pressure from Washington, about refusing to fall in line with demands that no longer matched India's interests. But underneath, it was the declaration that India has crossed a psychological threshold. For decades, India's military and strategic posture was described as reactive, slow, cautious. It would respond to threats but rarely dictate the narrative. It would build capabilities but hesitate to show intent. This moment signaled the end of that cycle. This was not just foreign policy. This was doctrine. Doctrine rooted in innovation, in the belief that strength is not just the size of your arsenal, but the creativity with which you deploy it. Not just the number of troops, but the vision that guides them. Not just technology borrowed from others, but technology created by your own hands that is why. This reply chilled the West, because they realized India's rise was no longer simply about economics or diplomacy. It was about the full spectrum of power. A new India was emerging, one that had studied decades of humiliation, wars, sanctions, lectures, and had decided that never again would it fight with borrowed tools or borrowed strategies. This India was crafting its own playbook. When Trump heard the reply, it was not just a refusal of his threat. It was India announcing that its power is now psychological as much as it is physical. The kind of power where even before you fight a war, you have already won because your enemy doubts his own leverage, doubts his ability to dictate, doubts the very ground he stands on. This psychological declaration had multiple layers. For the Indian military, it was a green light to pursue boldness. No more hesitation about building weapons that shock the world. No more delays in projects that were always pushed aside out of fear of international reaction. No more second guessing whether indigenous innovation would be respected or sanctioned. It told India's defense ecosystem that the political leadership stands behind innovation, that the time of apology for self-reliance is over, and the time of assertive doctrine has begun. For the West, it was a reminder that India's military strategy would no longer be predictable. A predictable India could be contained. An assertive India built on innovation could not. That unpredictability is what terrifies military planners in Washington, London, and Brussels. Think about it. For years, India was painted as a defensive power, a country that reacts only when provoked, a country that builds but hesitates to use, but the psychological declaration shifted that image. Now the world knows India has no problem standing up, no hesitation in confronting hypocrisy, no fear in openly defying powers that once dictated its behavior. And when that stance is combined with innovation missile systems that can rival the best in the world, space capabilities that place India on the moon, cyber tools that protect 1 billion, strong digital economy, you no longer have a regional power. You have a global player with its own identity, its own tools, its own doctrine. The chilling part is not that India replied. Countries reply to America all the time. The chilling part is that India replied with clarity, with confidence, without the slightest trace of fear. That tells the world something fundamental has shifted in India's national psychology. A country that once carried the trauma of colonialism now carries the confidence of a civilization that has outlived every conqueror. A country that once took lessons from others now writes its own. A country that once sought validation now declares itself as an equal without asking for permission. That is a psychological leap of such magnitude that it cannot be measured in GDP numbers or military budgets. It can only be measured in the way other nations suddenly recalculate how they deal with India. Consider how this changes deterrence. Military doctrine is not just about weapons. It is about how the enemy perceives your willingness to use them. The West has long believed India would hesitate, would hold back, would compromise under pressure, but this statement shattered that assumption. When India says it will act in its own interest regardless of Western disapproval, that extends to every sphere, economic, diplomatic, and military. That means adversaries now have to think twice, not because India threatens loudly, but because it no longer feels bound by anyone else's expectations. The silence of confidence is far more dangerous than the noise of threats. And that silence is what the reply projected across the world for domestic audiences. This declaration was oxygen. Indians who had watched their leaders navigate foreign affairs with too much caution now saw something different. They saw a minister who could look the most powerful nation in the eye and not blink. That creates a ripple effect inside a nation's psyche. It tells the military that its sacrifices are honored by political will. It tells scientists that their innovations will not be hidden in the shadows but showcased to the world. It tells the youth that their country no longer begs, it negotiates from strength. And it tells ordinary citizens that the days of feeling smaller than the West are over. That is how nations transform not just structurally, but spiritually. That is how 1 billion people begin to walk taller. Now ask yourself, why was the West so shocked? Because they are used to control through psychology. They do not always use force. Often, they use the power of narrative, convincing nations they are too weak, too dependent, too inexperienced to challenge Western order. But when India rejected that narrative with one chilling statement, it tore a hole in the psychological armor of the West itself. Suddenly, their usual tools, sanctions, lectures, pressure campaigns, looked weak, because if India is too big to intimidate, others will follow, and that domino effect is what the West fears most. The fear that if India can stand up, Africa will stand up, Latin America will stand up, Asia will stand up. That is why this moment was not just about one leader replying to another. It was about rewriting the psychology of global power. This is why the word equal carries so much weight here. Equal does not mean India has the exact same power as the U.S. in every metric. Equal means India refuses to accept an inferior seat at the table. Equal means India speaks with its own voice, not as a junior partner, not as a follower. Equal means India brings its military, economic, and civilizational strength to the table unapologetically. That declaration of equality is more dangerous to the West than any missile or tank, because equality undermines hierarchy, and the Western order survives on hierarchy, and the assumption that some nations lead while others follow. India shattered that assumption in one chilling stroke, and this psychological declaration was not just made to America. It was made to China, reminding Beijing that India will not be boxed into a corner. It was made to Pakistan, signaling that India does not seek validation for how it deals with threats. It was made to Russia, showing that India will not abandon old partners for the sake of Western approval. It was made to Europe, pointing out that moral lectures carry no weight against strategic interests. It was made to the global South, inspiring them that self-respect is possible. It was made to every Indian watching, proving that their nation can rise without fear. That is the scale of what happened. One reply, but infinite echoes across the world, so what we witnessed was the merging of diplomacy with doctrine. A doctrine where India no longer sees itself as a regional defender, but as a global innovator. A doctrine where military power is not just about weapons, but about psychological dominance. A doctrine where innovation in technology, strategy, and narrative becomes the foundation of deterrence. And above all, a doctrine where India claims equality without hesitation, without apology, without fear. That is what makes this reply a milestone. It is not the words themselves, it is the transformation they revealed. A transformation where India no longer plays by someone else's rules, but writes its own. A transformation where the psychological declaration of equality changes the very balance of world power.